today because. And so we don't, when we come to that decisive decision point, we don't say, well, what do we think we should do? By and large, we just say, well, what do they want us to do? Because why? It's their baby. It's their daughter. And so Paul's saying here, it's Jesus' church. Jesus is the one that we all submit to. He's King, He's Lord, and therefore we follow life the way He instructs us to. And what Jesus wants is this. He wants all of us to agree. Okay, now that sounds pretty unattainable, doesn't it? It sounds way too lofty. Literally, it means it's actually worse literally, because literally it's say the same thing. He said, I want you all to say the same thing. That sounds almost beyond human imagination, and we wouldn't really want that everybody says exactly the same words. The key here is that in the Greek language, that was a figure of speech, to say the same thing. What it was the equivalent of today would be to say, hey, we need to get on the same page. And so it implies discussion. It implies open-heartedness. It implies interaction and coming to the point that we're saying, well, okay, then we can agree we're going this direction. That's what he's saying, that type of agreement. And when he says perfectly minded, again, generally the NIV I think is a very good translation. But when I think perfect, I think perfect. I don't know about you. I think no mistakes, no faults, no errors, nothing lacking. And so if he says we're to be perfectly minded, right away it's kind of like, whoa, how's that going to happen? Well, again, the translation I don't think is accurate here. Really, the word means this. It means be mended together or be restored. The idea is of the restoration of a fishing net or a sailing vessel that has to restore the sails so that the boat can continue to sail. And what he's saying here is basically that relationships are in constant need of repair. We have a constant need to be focused on relationships, to be correcting course, to be making sure the relationship is right and it's good, and that we are saying the same thing, or in other words, we're on the same page. And so he gives us this exhortation that we'd be restored to the same mind. And that would be a very good translation of it. He says that you would be restored to the same mind, the same thinking, the same kind of direction. And key to this, I think, are a few things that God brought to my mind this week as I prepared the message. One of them is, and maybe these are because these are problems I have. Maybe that's why these came to my mind. But I'm going to share them with you. If they apply to you, take them. If they don't. But do you ever feel like you need to be right in every situation? Do you ever feel insecure if you feel like you don't know if you're right or not? I think the majority of arguments that people have really boil down to two people who both want to be right. And that kind of almost puts us in the same category as these Greeks who valued oratory more than they valued actual truth. And so what we need to do is to give up this sense, this need inside to be right. And on occasions where we are right, we need to give up what we believe is the right to be proven right. Do you know what I mean by that? That not only am I right, but I want you to admit it. And if you won't admit it, then there's something wrong with you, and I'm gonna keep talking at you and orating until you do admit that I am right. And that's a relational killer right there. It just destroys relationships. So we have to give up the perception that we need to be right about everything. And then when we are right, or when we're at least convinced we're right, we have to give up what we believe is the right to prove we're right. And then the third thing we have to give up is, and very similar, just to have the last word. Just to have the last word. At the end of the argument, the one who gets to say, okay, last. Or the one who gets to cap the argument off, or the discussion. We have to give up the right to have the last word. And if we do that, then we're going to be able to come to agreement We're going to be able to discuss issues and problems in our marriages, in our workplace, in every avenue of relationship in a way that will enable us to get on the same page and to have movement in the same direction. Well, the second thing here is Paul says this as he addresses the issue directly. He says that we really need to establish Christ as the foundation of life. And that's what the main point here is in these next verses. He said, some of you are saying, he says there are quarrels among you. Well, okay, let's just admit it. Quarrels are part of life. Are they not? You put a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old in a room together with a couple of toys, what are you going to have? You're going to have a quarrel. It's a part of life. That's why relationships constantly need attention, constantly need repair and mending, because quarrels are just part of life in this fallen world. But he says, some of you are saying, I'm of Paul, I follow Apollos, etc. I follow Peter. Cephas was another name for Peter. Okay? And then some, the super spiritual, the hyper spiritual ones, they say, oh, we follow Christ. And you might think, well, they're the ones that are right, but they're not even right because they're saying that in a judgmental and divisive way. And that was the main problem here. There's no problem with having a favorite speaker. There's no problem with having a favorite teacher or preacher or the person that led you to Christ or someone who ministered to me at a point of need in my life. There's no problem with loving that person and having a preference for them. The problem here was that they were focusing exclusively on that person and that they were debating with each other who was best. Is Peter better or is Paul? And then this real spiritual crowd comes in and says, oh, Christ is better. And we're the only ones that are really following him. And so they were just as argumentative and quarrelsome as the other ones were. But it's interesting, Paul doesn't really want anything to do with this. As we see, he says, is Christ divided? I mean, they're all picking their heroes. Just like the Greeks were prone to do. They're picking their heroes. And they're finding their security and identity in that hero. Just like some people have a horrible week if their football team loses or their baseball team loses. Some people are depressed over that. Well, why? We're probably attaching a little bit too much of our identity to someone else's success or failure. And that's what they were doing. They were attaching their spiritual identity to these leaders that they were following. And Paul, he says, is Christ divided? Was Christ chopped up at some point in time and divvied out, so you follow this guy, you get part, or that guy, you get part? But then more powerfully, he says, was Paul crucified for you? I mean, when you come down to it, you're really hitting a bottom line issue when you ask that question. And then he says, were you baptized into the name of Paul? Now the word into there has a powerful meaning to it because, well, we can illustrate it in English. If you go to the bank and you take some money and you put it into someone else's name, what have you done? You've given that money to them. You put it into their name. It's theirs. They are lord of that money from that moment on. In this Greek culture, when someone joined the army, they had to pledge themselves into Caesar's service. And what that meant was, Caesar is not only the king, but he is my Lord. I'm going to serve him, and I'll give my life for him. And so when Paul talks about being baptized into someone's name, he's not denigrating baptism at all, and he's not elevating it either. He's recognizing that baptism was a key moment, probably even more significant in this culture than it is in ours today. But he's saying when you came into Christ, when you professed openly that you were putting faith in Christ, and in this culture they did that through baptism pretty immediately. In our culture, we have baptism normally comes a little later after a person receives Christ. But in this culture, it identified the person as a Christian. What they were doing was they were placing themselves under the lordship and kingship